that you touched on the idea of that maybe there's the opportunity to be happy and have a sort of fulfilled life or something. And I think most people would agree to that, wouldn't they? If you ask most people, they said, "Do you want to be happy?" They said yes, and they'll be happy most of the time. A composer that I'm interested in said once, he said, "Can one be happy when we know others are not?"
Right. Which composer, by the way?
Mahler.
Right.
And that's the sort of thing he would say.
He would say, yes. Well, I think, yes, I think you can be happy, or you can work towards happiness. Remember, the Stoics are they're interested in, do you want to film this rather than... The Stoics are more interested in working towards happiness. So I think we can work towards happiness while others are not. But of course, part of that process is going to be doing everything in your power to make other people happy. So that's really what I was stressing. So your happiness doesn't depend on, as it were, everyone else being happy. But you can work toward, but nonetheless, part of the way you become happy is through that sharing process. So I think that would be a better response than just going into a sort of romantic state because not everyone is happy. I'm not trying to get at Marlowe.
No.
Here we are, have a handout. Okay, any other preliminary questions? I think we might just hang on one more second. Or any follow-ons from the morning session? Okay, maybe we should get going. Okay. Right, so there's a handout. And I want to begin by just reading out the first points on the handout. These are three key ideas, or four key ideas actually, about nature that we put in the handbook, and I want to begin by asking about these. The Stoics think that leading a life with virtue as your goal is the natural way for a human being to live. The Stoics encourage us to think that if we create a wholeness and coherence of moral character in ourselves, we're matching the coherence and unity they see in the world as a whole. The Stoics also encourage us to view ourselves as integral parts of nature, point 2. Today, many human beings are all aware that they need to think about themselves. They need to think more about the impact of human actions on the natural environment and to see themselves within the context of nature. And the Stoic worldview can help us to develop this attitude. 3, for the Stoics, our life cycle, our birth and our death are integral parts of our life in nature. And realizing this can help us to accept these events, including our own death and that of others. The Stoics believe that most species of animals, and especially the human species, are naturally sociable in character. We naturally form attachments and we naturally live in communities. From this natural affection stems the Stoic ideal of the community of humankind, which is illustrated by the Marcus quotation. Now, what I want to do in this workshop is to explore with you these Stoic ideas, especially numbers 1, 2, and 4. I said something about 3 this morning. I want to find out more about what they mean, and more especially to ask if such ideas are still credible to us today. The idea that the best human life, the life centered on virtue, is a life according to nature, is a central one in Stoic philosophy. But is it one we can still accept or find useful? Or should we just focus on Stoic ethics and psychology, taken in their own terms, and set aside the idea that these ethical principles are according to nature? The Stoic account of nature, their physics, makes many assumptions that are in conflict with the modern scientific view of nature. They think, for instance, that everything is composed of a mixture of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and that the universe is a combination of an active force and a passive one, the active one sometimes identified with God. Also, of course, following Darwin's ideas about the evolution of the species and more recent work on the genetic development of human life, it's difficult for us to talk about human nature as something definite and fixed, as Stoicism does. So, my question is, can we still wholeheartedly adopt the idea that the Stoic account of the good life is according to nature? What I want to suggest in this workshop is that this idea can still remain useful to us today and a useful supplement to Stoic ethics, even though the Stoic view of nature is not one we can accept fully. Though exactly how far we can or cannot accept it is something I want to consider later. So I start with point 2 above, and then I'm going to make some suggestions, and then pause for your reactions to that first point, and then I'll go on to some of the other aspects of their view about nature. So there'll be plenty of time for you to feed into this workshop. So let's look at 2. The Stoics encourage us to view ourselves as integral parts of nature. Today, many people are aware that they need to think more about the impact of human actions on the natural environment, and the Stoic worldview can help us develop this attitude. Well, why bring in the current environmental crisis? And I mean here especially global warming and its huge consequences, which are in large measure a result of human action, and which pose a serious threat to the future of human and other forms of life on this planet. The Stoics did not, of course, have anything directly to say on this crisis, which is a purely modern phenomenon. So why bring them in? Is this a desperate attempt to make Stoicism relevant today? No, you might say. No, it's not. There are 2 reasons for doing so. One is that the environmental crisis and the role of humans in causing this brings home to us the force of an idea that has not always formed part of modern moral thinking. Modern moral thinking tends to be focused on purely human matters. The Stoics, on the other hand, think that ethics or morality needs to take account of the fact that human life is part of the broader natural world and that we are integral parts of nature. So this is a key idea for Stoic ethics, as already stressed. And the environmental crisis makes it much more difficult for us to reject the idea that ethics and our attitude to nature need to be brought together and not kept in separate boxes. So I think that's one reason. That's one reason in Stoicism. It's one reason why Stoicism, again, can seem potentially important in a way that it hasn't until now. The second reason for bringing in Stoicism is this, and these points are summarised in passage 2 on the handout. The second reason for bringing in Stoicism is this. I think that the Stoics can help us formulate an effective moral response to the environmental crisis. Obviously, they've got nothing useful to say to the scientific side of the question. More precisely, they can help us as individual moral agents to reflect on how we should respond to this crisis. Governmental or intergovernmental responses are obviously also very important, but they raise different kinds of questions. When this topic is discussed in modern life, the issue is often couched in terms of a conflict between our human interests and those of the planet. More specifically, between our short-term economic interests and our duty to the planet or to future human generations. Alternatively, the conflict is presented as being between what benefits us now and what will benefit the environment or the planet or future generations. I think this topic can be more effectively discussed in terms of virtue and happiness. These are the standard categories of ancient and some modern ethical philosophy, and more especially in terms of Stoic ethics. Stoic ethics emphasizes, first, that our happiness depends solely on developing the virtues, and secondly, that this development forms a key component of our lives as natural entities, human beings, rational animals, who form an integral part of nature. And if we transfer these ideas to the modern context, I think this can help us to frame an effective moral response as individual moral agents to the environmental crisis. We should think about the virtues as forms of understanding and character that bear on our actions and attitudes as regards the natural environment, as well as towards other people. By the same token, we should see human happiness as based directly on the virtues, and on virtues which are expressed in our actions regarding the natural environment, as well as other people. In other words, in conceiving virtue and happiness as an expression of the life according to nature, we should take account of nature in a broad sense, the environmental context of human life, and not just focus on human life taken in isolation. Why, you might say, is this way of thinking about the environmental crisis more helpful than other ways of discussing the issue from a moral standpoint? Partly, I think, because it can help us generate the internal motivation to act appropriately in this respect. Current ways of thinking about the crisis tend, as I've noted earlier, to present the situation as a conflict between our interests, pursuing our interests or well-being, and the claims of the environment or of future generations. The Stoic way of framing the issue underlines the idea that our happiness depends on leading an environmentally sustainable life. More precisely, the Stoic style formulation stresses that our happiness depends directly on developing the virtues, wisdom, self-control, justice, courage, that provide the basis for an environmentally sustainable life, among other things. To put it very simply, on this view, you cannot feel good about yourself, you cannot feel that your happiness is properly grounded unless you have done everything in your power to develop the virtues in a way that provides the basis for environmentally sustainable actions, among other kind of virtuous actions. Also relevant here are the Stoic ideas about the brotherhood of humankind, as well as the belief that human life in general has a broader, natural, environmental context. On the Stoic style view that I'm recommending, developing the virtues that enable us to lead a sustainable life forms an integral part of our lives as members of the community of humankind, now and in the future, as well as members of a species whose lives form an integral part of natural life on this planet. And motivation seems to be crucial here, because although many of us, perhaps most of us in some societies, pay lip service to environmental concerns, we do not consistently act on this basis. If we did, there wouldn't be a crisis, or it wouldn't perpetuate in the way that it is. So if we could come to see that our happiness as human beings depends on acting in this way, in part at least, this would have a more powerfully motivating effect than other current ways of framing the debate. Okay, so that's my case for Stoicism and global warming. So I'd be interested to know your reactions to that. And then we'll go on to other aspects of Stoicism and nature, again. So just if we can sort of focus in the first instance on this aspect of things. Yeah.
My first response is the arguments you put forward seem to very much about a personal reaction to this.
Yeah.
The nature of the environmental crisis, assuming we accept the scientific evidence for it, is that something really has to be done, well now, by
yes.
governments, by
yes.
populations as a
Absolutely.
whole. So if the argument is that we should be relying on individuals influencing their neighbours
Sure.
and then other people, this might well take quite a long time.
It
In
might.
fact, there's a time scale that is forced
Yeah.
upon us. So I'd be interested to talk about
Well, I have
really
to.
points to moving into the political sphere.
Sure.
And how Stoicism.
I agree with that
Point.
100%. I think I'm not saying that Stoicism. I'm not saying that we should only think about this aspect. I have two reasons, I think, for thinking this question is very important. One is that the modern world is very highly individualistic. That we in all societies, not just the West now, it's also in China and the Far East, individualism, what you might call consumer individualism, is a very prevalent way of thinking about it. So people have to be addressed as individuals. They have to see that it matters to them. We can no longer live in a society where a few people make decisions on behalf of everyone else, even elected leaders, and assume that will work. So I think an individual approach to everyone, potentially, as individual agents, matters. I also think that government action matters. I do very much think that. But the second reason is this. Governments have to act in our name, or at least in democracies. Perhaps in all societies, to some extent, they have to act in our name, the names of the populations they claim to represent. And so, therefore, governments need justifications. Now, if part of the justification then for taking what will be in some ways painful decisions is that it is supporting a sense of happiness and the right way to act that is widely shared. So I think there's two reasons, but I'm not for one moment ruling out governmental action. Where does your happiness lie? Your happiness lies in leading a healthy and a life in accordance with nature in that respect. I think we've really lost touch with what a natural life is now in terms of health and activity. We need to recover that. Yes.
I was going to touch on that.
Yes.
I mean, I think, as I understand what's been said, I think I accept the general direction of what you said, as I understand it. And I think it's reasonable to suppose that one should have, and I should use my words, one should have regard for oneself and oneself's well-being, and that should be matched by a similar care to the planet and planet Earth. And I think that's a reasonable supposition. They're both interrelated, of course, as you've said.
Yes.
So that's fine. I'm sure if we had a doctor here, as you've just suggested, they would say that on an individual basis, we are actually very bad, from a medical point of view, of having regard to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And if we had an environmentalist here, they would say the same about the planet. Mm-hmm. So we're not doing very well, even though we acknowledge that these are desirable ways forward. And it leads me on to one little phrase here, actually, under number one. The Stoics think that leading a life with virtue and goal is the natural way of a human being to live. Well, you see, I'm not sure that it is. I'm not sure that it is. I think it's it's a desirable way.
Yes.
The fact that we are so poor at having regard to ourselves and having a total disregard to the planet suggests that maybe it's not natural at all.
Yes. This point has come up. This was brought up against the ancient Stoics, and ancient critics said, "Oh, you say that the life according to virtue is a natural one. In that case, why are people so terrible? Why is the world full of successful criminals and so forth?" But by natural, they don't mean that, as it were, everyone behaves in that way. They mean that if everyone developed the qualities that are at a deep level natural to them, if everyone, as it were, answered to the deepest principles that they're capable of forming, that would be the natural life. Now you might say, well, that's something different again, but that's what they mean by it. So the whole question of what is natural it's not as, it's profound, but it's not simple.
Right.
So understanding what nature is, in a sense, our lives are those of coming to understand what nature means, as much as we try to understand what virtue means. So, but it was a common objection.
Yes.
And it's, there is a truth to it, isn't there? Because we're on a kind of journey, and we're trying to, yes, we've made a lot of terrible mistakes. But I think what Stoicism can say is, well, it's no good just beating yourself up about this. You then need to do everything in your power to kind of correct those mistakes and to develop the kinds of virtues that can address them. And I think that's another kind of resilience. It's kind of collective resilience we can show towards the healthcare problems, the environmental problems, and indeed some of the socio-economic problems we have. But let's not try and solve all the problems in 1 hour. Okay, thanks. Yes, more questions?
Yeah, I mean, this relates to a kind of general question about Stoicism, that it seems to be based on a view of nature as being benevolent and organised.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, I guess, we're used to thinking of nature as being very violent, competitive, survival of the fittest.
Sure.
And the kind of people who don't care about environmentalism would say, well, we're just following nature.
Yeah.
We're just being competitive, why shouldn't we behave?
Well, I want to say a bit more about their view of nature and why they think it's providential and why they think it's benevolent and ordered in the next section. I think I would have thought actually that the environmental crisis might give those people pause, because if it is the case that if they really believe that the good human life is a life of competition and elbowing other people out of the way and doing everything that you want to do now and abusing natural resources and so on, I would have thought the environmental crisis might say, well, suddenly what's happened is nature's bitten back, hasn't it? Nature is in the room now. We can't ignore the environmental crisis as a fact. So we have actually done something wrong. And even the most aggressively self-interested, if you like, are going to have to face that fact, I would have said. So I think that the environmental crisis is a real, to use this crude phrase, wake-up call to people who think that that's the good way to live. So I would have thought, now, of course, they may not hear it.
No.
And you can't always, the Stoics didn't think that everyone's going to hear what you say, but you can still say it. But I do think the environmental, the environmental crisis is a real check, as it were, on some of our ideas, or some of certain modern ideas. Of course, not everyone by any means accepts that kind of crude social Darwinism that says that competition is the best way forward. There's many debates, as you know, in about what is, as it were, natural in that sense, in the modern world, just as there were in the ancient world. But we will look a bit more at providence and order in a minute, and I'll see how far we can really accept what they say. Okay, other questions on this point?
I was just wondering, I don't think
Yes.
Do you think Stoicism is politically neutral philosophy?
No, I don't think it's politically neutral, but it's not. In the ancient world, there were certain philosophies, there were Platonic philosophies and Aristotelian philosophies which conducted political theory in the form of saying, what is the best kind of state? Is it a democracy? Is it a monarchy? Is it an oligarchy? And there were many debates about this. And we have Plato's Republic, we have Aristotle's Politics. In the Hellenistic world, where Stoicism and Epicureanism arose, we don't find that kind of theory. Why? Well, there might be various reasons, but one reason probably was that politically in that period it was dominated by military leaders, the successors of Alexander the Great. And so that kind of theory, you could have conducted it, but it would be purely theoretical. You couldn't put it into practice in any real sense at that time. And so what you have developing at that period is a view of politics that says, well, how should you live politically, how should you live well under any political framework? Because you can't determine the political framework. So how can you live virtuously under monarchy, or under tyranny, or under oligarchy, or under empire, or under democracy? So that's the question. So what the Stoics want to say is, you should engage in politics if you can, if it isn't run by thugs. You should engage, which it often was. You should engage in politics, you should be a member of your community, you should be a member of your family, you should try and live virtuously, but you can do that in any situation. So in that sense, it's politically neutral. But it's not neutral when it came to specific concrete cases. In the Roman Stoics, a number of because in the Roman world, a number of the leading Stoics were also members of the leading political class. And they got very much involved in politics, and they were often troublemakers for the emperors. And they were rather famous for challenging the emperor, for making gestures, and indeed for plotting to get rid of them or kill them. So Stoics did engage in politics where they could. Sorry, a bit of a long answer. But they're not just people who say, oh, well, just lie down and enjoy it. It's much more complicated than that. Of course, a lot of the world now, you can't, I mean, we're lucky. We live in a democracy. Most people don't. Most people live in military dictatorships or top-down, top-down states. So Stoicism can still be practiced in those countries where lots of other things can't. Shall we go on to the second sort of section of themes, which tackles some of the questions you've quite rightly raised about the sort of broader framework of Stoic thinking. Okay, so now I'm looking at 1 and 4 especially. Okay. So the question I want to focus on now is whether we can still make sense of the Stoic view that leading a good human life can be seen as, in some sense, modelling yourself on nature or on the universe. Is this view still tenable in the light of the differences between the Stoic and the modern worldview, which I outlined earlier, but I'm sure there are more? And incidentally, I'm not assuming, for this purpose, that we should approach the question from a committed religious standpoint. I'm trying to raise the question in broad terms, which can make sense to people whether or not they have a religious faith and worldview. We'd have to have a different kind of discussion if you were saying, well, how does this relate to different kinds of religions? We have had those discussions in these workshops. So here are some relevant ideas, slightly adapted from a key Stoic source for this topic. Living in accordance with virtue, and this is on the handout at the bottom of the first page. Living in accordance with virtue is equivalent to living in accordance with nature. That's point 3 on the handout. For our natures are part of the whole of nature. Therefore, living in agreement with nature comes to be the end, that is the proper goal of a human life. The virtue of the happy person and his good flow of life, his happiness, are just this, always doing everything on the basis of the agreement of each person's guardian spirit, that is their mind or reason, with the will of the administrator of the whole, that is, with the right reason pervading everything. A rather lot of ideas there, but we'll unpack them gradually. Well, the idea that the core of human ethical life, our virtue and our happiness, can be understood as modelling ourselves on the universe, on the whole, or the reason which pervades the whole, is a common one in Stoic ethics, and we find frequent expressions of this idea in Epictetus and Marcus, as well as in this, which is from a more technical, theoretical discussion. But what on earth does it mean? And can it mean anything to us today, with a very different worldview? That's the question. The central idea, I think, is that as we develop ethically, we come to recognize key aspects of this process as mirroring key features of the natural universe of which we are a natural part. And these ideas are sort of summarized in point 4 on the handout at the bottom of the first page and over the top of the second. And this helps us understand the best human life, the life of happiness based on virtue, as being a life in accordance with nature. Well, what are these key ideas that are common to us and to nature? Well, the key aspects are creating a wholeness and coherence in us that matches the wholeness and coherence of the universe as they see it. And, secondly, developing an attitude of providential care that matches the same feature in nature as a whole. So this Stoic idea raises several questions, and let's take them one by one. These further questions are set out on top of page 2 of the handout. First of all, why is becoming virtuous and so happy a matter of developing wholeness and coherence? Well, Stoics think that the character, understanding, and life of the virtuous person are marked by a range of types of consistency, order, and structure, which are absent from the character of ethically defective people. For instance, Stoics see the virtue as a matched set of qualities that are internally consistent, and which bring consistency, order, and structure to the state of mind, emotional life, actions, and pattern of relationships of the virtuous person. They see the defective person as marked by incoherence and inconsistency in all these various respects. So secondly, my second question is, what are the analogous marks of wholeness and coherence in the universe? There are a number of relevant features, but perhaps the most important idea is this. Natural processes, they believe, are marked by consistency, regularity, and structure. The most obvious signs of this are features such as the alternation of night and day, the cycle of the seasons, the patterned regularity of planetary movements, about which they knew quite a lot, the repeated patterns of vegetable and animal birth, maturity and death, the life cycle. And nature as a whole, that's one point. Nature as a whole, the Stoics are often thinking of the world rather than the universe, but nature as a whole in the universe, they think, constitutes an interconnected, organic, or biological unit, and not simply a random set of material objects. That's another idea. A related idea is that all events in nature form part of an interconnected causal nexus, a seamless web of cause and effect. Hence, even events that seem to us unpredictable, violent, and disruptive of order, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, form part of this interconnected and, in principle, predictable, may not be predictable by us, but it's in principle predictable causal way. So that's the second response to the second question. The third question, how is the development of human providential care linked with that seen in nature as a whole? The Stoics see nature as a source of providential care in the sense that all human species, all animal species, are naturally equipped and motivated so as to preserve and maintain their own life and character. Nature also acts as a source of providential care, in the sense that all human species are naturally equipped and naturally motivated to care for their own young, their own offspring. In the case of human beings, this motive of providential care is susceptible of being deepened and extended to include sustained family and communal involvement, and also coming to see all humanity as part of a world community, as touched on this morning and at various points. In exercising providential care in this way, human beings are thus expressing the providential care in nature. They're acting out, if you like, the providentiality that's built into them, and also consciously imitating it, modelling their own actions on patterns found in nature as a whole. Now, this set of ideas, the ones I've just outlined, was seen in antiquity as bold, speculative, highly controversial. It was challenged. I mean, it wasn't that everyone in the ancient world believed this. The Stoics believed it, the Epicureans didn't, the skeptics questioned it. So it was always controversial, not just now. But my sense is, and we can think about those aspects, but my question here is to say whether we can make any sense of these ideas, and if so, whether we might want to adopt them, or any version of them, or whether these are aspects of Stoicism that must remain of purely historical interest, even if we adopt other aspects of Stoicism. So, I think there's three questions that arise, the last three questions I put on point 5 of the handout. Can we make sense of the Stoic idea of what constitutes ethical development in terms of internal coherence and order and providential care? Can we make sense of the Stoic claims about the coherence and structure of nature as a whole, and about its role as a source of providential care? Can we accept as valid the Stoic assumption that we can and should conceive of ethical development as a matter of modelling yourself on key features of the natural universe, or at least the world as a whole? Now, so those are the questions which I hope you'll respond to, and I'll be interested to know your views shortly, but I'm going to stick my neck out and make some suggestions on these questions. I suspect, I may be wrong, that the first point about how ethical development is conceived is relatively uncontroversial. This may not be how we're used to thinking about ethical development, but I hope the general line of approach is clear enough and potentially worth adopting, at least worth thinking about. The second point about natural order, I think, is more controversial, as it was in antiquity. And you may feel, in fact I know one of you have already raised this, that the overall view of nature as a whole is coherent and structured, is simply not compatible with the modern scientific worldview, though I would be glad to know exactly where you think the incompatibility lies. I think that's a sort of harder question. On the other hand, it seems to me that the component features of this view, what the Stoics take as indicators of natural coherence and order within the world or universe as we see it now, can also be taken in this way today. I'm thinking about what they cite as indicators of regularity of order and indicators of regularity and order. Night and day, the cycle of planetary movements and so on. And their idea of nature as an organic or biological whole, and not simply a collection of objects. And the idea that a seamless web of causation underlies all natural processes. These ideas, of course, may strike us as naive and non-technical, but it's not clear to me that the Stoics are actually just straightforwardly wrong in this regard, and in seeing them as markers of coherence and order. What about the third point, the underlying assumption that ethical development can appropriately be conceived in terms of patterning yourself on core features of the natural universe as a whole. Again, this idea is partly perhaps unfamiliar and doesn't fit in with a number of modern ways of thinking about morality and moral theory. But if we take seriously the Stoic claim, which I think is in itself plausible, that we, human beings, form integral parts of the natural world, why should we not conceive ethical development in this way? Is it not rather reasonable to expect that our life, at its best, and our development towards the best life, should represent a version of deep structural patterns which are present in nature as a whole, such as, on the Stoic view at any rate, coherence and order and providential care? So I want to suggest that these Stoic ideas are ones that we can not only make sense of, but ones we might want to adopt today, even if our current understanding of nature might lead to some variations or modifications in the way that we do adopt them. So there's a second set of ideas there which you might want to respond to, and a number of questions that I've raised there. So any thoughts? Yeah?
Yeah, this is just first, wasn't it? It's about the understanding the sort of deep structure of nature and characterising it either as red in tooth and claw or cooperative.
Yeah.
Isn't there a sort of loop here where, in fact, throughout history we see that those characterisations tend to be imposed, if you like, by whatever is the social system at the time. So we have Darwinism and social Darwinism, which, and then we have post-World War II, we have perhaps a more willingness to see the cooperative parts of it. So in other words, aren't we imposing narratives on nature rather than, in fact, another question is there a value system that nature embodies, or is it just there?
Right, well that would be, yes, I guess there's two, I think what they thought, there were two aspects to this question. One is looking at nature, trying to find out about it, and they did engage in what, the science of their day. So one is trying to give the best account of nature as you can, in terms of, as it were, the science of your day. That's one aspect. The other aspect then, and this is the different aspect, which wouldn't fit in with some of these ideas you've just mentioned, is if you're going to say that our accounts of nature have to be correlated in some way with our understanding of ethics, they'd say, well, we need to do, as it were, the best possible form of ethics. Okay, so if we're going to say that nature has something to say to us about ethics, we've got to come up with a sophisticated and convincing account of nature. So for them, the idea that nature is ready, that people are naturally competitive and try to elbow their way out of, and try to exploit, that to them would not present itself to them as a very convincing account of a convincing ethical account. Similarly, these ideas of the selfish gene, the Dawkins ideas, of course, they have been much criticised, the Dawkins idea too. That would strike them as naive, it would strike them as a low level, if you like putting it crudely, of moral argument. So I think the challenge for them is to show that, as it were, the best science and the best ethics can be brought, can be shown to be consistent. Now, it's a hard challenge, but I think it's a reasonable one. That what you need to appeal to, if you're trying to show that these two have some relation to each other, is, as it were, the best account of each of them that you can provide. Does that help, perhaps? No, perhaps it raises even more.
I'm still left with the thought that, in fact, it's almost like a mirror, so there's a predisposition on our part to see nature in a certain way. So hence you have all these arguments that, obviously all the way through history about nature, nurture and cooperation, competition, and they just go on and on and on. But in other words, is there actually a final answer? Will science deliver the answer that says, nature is actually cooperative?
I don't think
you can give lots of examples here and there, but at the end of the day, it's
I don't think science on its own, as it were, can deliver these answers. I mean, that's why I think what they thought And I think here the Stoic analysis is a good one, really. They thought that you need to bring, that what we need to work towards is a harmonious understanding that combines, as they think, logic, but which then would include many aspects of philosophy, the more technical aspects of philosophy, ethics, our understanding of key moral notions, our understanding of nature, and that what we're trying to do is to achieve a coherent and consistent understanding of all these in relation to each other. I think you're right. If you just take nature on its own, if you just take, as it were, and say, look, we've got to, we're looking to science, as it were, to give us answers to moral questions, it can't do that. Science is a certain kind of methodology, and it's designed to achieve, a certain kind of epistemological status, but it can't, on its own, deliver the results. On the other hand, the view that was quite current from the 18th century until the 20th century, from Kant and so on onwards, that we just do morality on its own and set science aside, I think that's a mistake too. That's a kind of despair, it seems to me. And that's why ethics for 200 years has just focused on purely human questions about duty and benefit, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It's been focused on just the human domain. And I think the very, in a way, liberating effect of looking at ancient ideas is that they try and reconnect the world of nature and the world of ethics. And I think, as I say, for a long time you could just ignore that, but I think we can't ignore it now because nature, as I was saying before, has reasserted its presence in our lives. And we've learnt that these things are not just in separate boxes. So that's why I think we have to try and connect the two. But science on its own can't give us the answer, just as ethics on its own can't give us the answer.
Is the Stoic view of nature quite tied up with the providence of nature, the order?
Yes.
Tied up with the idea of a benevolent God, and that might be wrong.
No, well, it depends, yes and no. It depends what you mean. They don't believe that, first of all, they don't believe in a personal God. God is God. They believe that the universe is a combination of an active force and a passive element. So God is equivalent to, as it were, all the forms of, if you like, energy in the universe. And God is also equivalent to all the fine forms of rationality in the universe. So this bottle has God in it because it has structure and order and coherence. And you have God in you because you have rationality in you. So God is quite, but that's rather different from the sort of traditional God of, Judeo-Christian framework, or Islamic, as far as I understand. So that's one thing. They also don't believe that, they don't believe in providence in the sense that they think, if you're a good Stoic, everything's going to be okay, you'll never be ill. They don't believe in that kind of thing. So there's lots of kind of naive providentiality they don't believe in. So they believe in providentiality in the sense I've just described, that nature is such that the creatures in it are instinctively driven to preserve themselves and to maintain their own species identity and to propagate. Of course, that you can get that same result from different ways. You can get it from Darwinism, you can get it from evolutionary theory, but it is, they saw it as part of nature's providentiality. So caring for others is part of nature's generosity, if you like, the generosity of nature in giving us those capacities and instincts. So it's quite a sophisticated form of providentiality. Yeah.
Two things. Firstly, is for the Stoics, would the idea of learning about and knowing nature in its broadest sense be roughly the same as knowing themselves? Does knowing nature mean knowing ourselves better, if we are that linked? And secondly, is it a useful thought experiment to think about what if we could bring back Chrysippus or Marcus or whoever, would make of later scientific knowledge? Say, I'm thinking about extinction events, and one of the major aspects of the modern environmental crisis is diminished biodiversity, but we know that that is a fact of life on Earth, whether its cause is anthropogenic or not. What would be the Stoic response if it existed in a homogeneous way?
They don't believe that, as it were, God created all the species that there are, and there are a finite number of species, and they will always be around. There's nothing about that. They also believe, by the way, that there are periodic, what you might call big bangs. They believe in cycles of, indeterminate number of centuries, and at the end of these cycles, everything goes back into cosmic fire and is reconstituted. So they have quite a number of beliefs that might strike us as unexpected, but also quite different from, as it were, a traditional Judeo-Christian worldview. I don't know that they would be, I think, as regards the extinction of species, they would say, well, this is the working out of the causal web, that those species have become extinct because of actions that have been taken by other animals and so on. So I don't think I think they could explain that. What they resist is randomness, the idea, and this of course might be a problem. I've never understood the theory of relativity or indeterminacy, but that might bother them. But they think the universe is in principle intelligible, and that might be something we would question. I don't know.
How would they respond to, say, catastrophism within?
Well, it depends. What is catastrophism?
That versus gradualism as a driver for sort of evolutionary change,
can you just tell me what it is?
So that the six extinctions, say for example like the KT band, the extinction of the dinosaurs, and however the kind of reset button gets pressed. I suppose they just see that as another cycle starting.
Yes, that's part of the study. It would say, there are natural causes that led to, these creatures becoming dominant, and then, other species emerged, which I don't think they would have any problem with that. The total, if nature ceased to generate life at all, and if that happened, by purely, as it were, natural means, that would be a problem for them, because that would be a contradiction. They think nature is in some sense creative. It is a designing fire, as they saw it. But I think none of the things you've mentioned would strike them as particularly problematic. Our own, we may be facing the end of our species, but it will be, so that would not, in principle. I think they would find it quite sad, but I don't think they would find that intellectually problematic, because they just say, oh, well, it's just the causal web. You brought it on yourselves, which is sadly what our situation may be. But anyway, yeah.
I was just wondering, there's an environmentalist called Lovelock, I think his name might be.
Yes.
This idea of gear.
Yeah.
And this is kind of harmonious whole, and we're always looking for stability and all this sort of stuff. Do you link that to this kind of thinking?
I think that actually, I think the Gaia philosophy, I don't know a lot about it. I think it taps into lots of ideas. I think it is generally true of Stoicism, and actually, and Aristotle, and a number of other ancient ideas, that they had a much stronger sense of themselves as natural entities, and that are, partly because their lives were less complicated, less technologically complicated, and less. And I think they did have a sense that at the end of the day, we have to see ourselves as part of the earth, if you like. So I think there are links there. But Yes. You, any other point? You look as
So
if you've got a point.
yeah, I think that, I mean, the distinctive Stoic values are wisdom, justice,
Yes.
self-discipline, and what's the other one?
Justice.
Yeah. These are few of the human things, aren't they? I mean,
They are, yes, but what they think, okay, so what they think, okay, so these are aspects, for us to develop those, we develop those through our use of rationality, our use of language, our capacity for inference, our capacity for organisation. Other animals, they thought, perhaps wrongly, couldn't develop those things because they thought, again, perhaps wrongly, that other animals are not rational. We wouldn't go as far as that. I think we think animals are rational in some respects, some rational, and so on. So those virtues, yes, they are purely human because they're purely rational. But we are natural, we're animals, we're animals of a certain kind. We're animals with certain rather complex capacities. And for us, the life according to nature is for us to develop those complex capacities for rationality, which the highest development of which is the development of virtue. So it isn't that the virtues are just kind of purely human on their own. They're part of the natural life, just as developing a body and and using your body and exercising that is also part of your natural capacity. Does that help? So they don't think that they're all again, they don't think it's all in separate boxes. The life of virtue is the best life for a human being.
I mean, is it most useful to make a distinction between the Stoic view of virtue and, say, a Christian view, which isn't based on nature in the same way?
Well, no, but it is based. Christian view would also be surely that the life of virtue is a natural life because it's the life that God would want people to live, and God is.
Original sin.
Should we leave? I was just sticking with actual. Well, anyway, original sin. Yes, I don't know about that, but there's certainly ways of interpreting a Christian view which would think that that's we're leading. If we're leading a good life, we're leading the life that God wants us to live. So it's a different way of putting it, of course. But the Christian God is a God of nature. But I don't really want to get into we get into all sorts of other questions then. Yes.
Just
one last one.
Yeah. It's just curious. What did the Stoics have to say about how obligations, if you like, to individuals of other species? So in other words,
they're not brilliant on that. I haven't.
You said they were not rational.
Yes, I haven't. I wouldn't want to give a workshop on that because I don't think they're so brilliant about that. But I think that their views are not as bad as are sometimes described. But I think I suppose they inherited a view about which they didn't examine fully. But at least, I tell you one good thing about their view, is at least they think that human beings are most valuable or whatever, not because they're human, not because we're human, because we're rational. And so what's good about us isn't something that's species-specific. So in that sense, they're not anthropocentric. They don't think that we've been singled out as a species. We've been singled out because we're rational, and to the extent that we're rational. They also, of course, think that rationality is everywhere. As again, this bottle has not rationality, but it's got order. And they thought the highest instantiation of rationality is not us, but the universe as a whole, which is an interestingly humbling, I hope, view. Okay, all right, we're going to break now and off to the plenary session down in the main lecture room. So thank you very much for your questions.